Vignette 6. Nopula Ambush by Commander Sophie Lalghul. In December 1980, I led a group of 12 Mujahideen in an ambush on the Kabul-Sherakar highway at Nopula near Karabakh. We were armed with Kalashnikov rifles and 2 RPG-7s. I selected the ambush site at a point where orchards and other vegetation provide covered approaches to the road and offer concealed positions for the ambush team. 15. We left our base at Farza, some 10 kilometers to the west, long before daybreak to arrive at the ambush site before sunrise. I deployed my force into 2 ambush positions near the road and placed a 3-man flank security team on the road which intersected with the main highway, Map 7 Nopula. About 0900 hours, an enemy column of trucks, jeeps, and armored vehicles arrived. As the head of the column passed our ambush position kill zone, we opened fire on the convoy and destroyed one of the leading tanks with a direct hit by RPG-7. As the convoy unsuccessfully scurried to take cover, our fire destroyed a jeep and an APC. Explosions in the disabled vehicles set some trucks on fire. The enemy returned fire but failed to use its infantry to attack us directly. The action continued for less than an hour. When enemy aircraft arrived over the ambush site, we broke contact and pulled out through the green zone. We had no casualties, while we destroyed or damaged 1 tank, 1 APC, 1 jeep, and 8 trucks. Commentary. The Mujahideen group achieved surprise by deploying in the dark and using the covered area close to the road for the ambush. The small number of the Mujahideen limited its action to 1 strike, after which they had to pull out. Failure to act decisively cost the convoy several vehicles and allowed the Mujahideen to slip away unscathed. The passive response of the Soviets, caught and ambushed often, was due to the fact that they were carrying very few infantry in their escorting personnel carriers. The cover provided by the orchards and vegetation that flanked both sides of the Kabul-Sherakar highway helped the Mujahideen lay successful ambushes. Later in the war, the Soviets destroyed the roadside orchards and villages to prevent the Mujahideen from using them in their ambushes. Vignette 7. 2 Convoys in the Kill Zone by Toriale Hemat. In the summer of 1986, the Soviets and DRA were moving lots of reinforcements and supplies to Paktia province. We set an ambush on Highway 157 south of Muhammad Aga district, headquarters on the 12th of July. This was 4 days after an ambush at the Mamar Hotel. I sighted the ambush along a 2-kilometer stretch between Kala-i-Shakak and Dehi-Na. Kala-i-Shakak is 6 kilometers south of Muhammad Aga, and Dehi-Na is 3 kilometers further south from Kala-i-Shakak. There was a DRA outpost at Kala-i-Shakak, so we started our ambush a kilometer south of the outpost. The outpost was surrounded by mines, and the DRA seldom left the outpost. I felt that the DRA might shoot at us, but would not attack from the outpost. Map 8, 2 convoys. I had 35 Mujahideen in my group. I divided them into 4 groups: a northern containment group, an ambush group, a southern security group, and a support group. The northern containment group was to fire on the DRA outpost to prevent them from interfering with our ambush. The ambush group would attack the convoy from close up. The southern security group would occupy a position at Dehi-Na to protect our southern flank and prevent the arrival of reinforcements from the south. These 3 groups were armed with AK-47s, PK machine guns, and RPGs. The support group had 1 82mm mortar and a Guryunov machine gun, 17. I positioned the support group on the east bank of the Logar River behind the ambush group. All the groups were on the east side of the road. We moved from Amadzi Kala before dawn and occupied our ambush positions. We did not have any advance information on the movement of columns, but there were enough columns moving to Paktia. At this time, there was usually a daily column, so it was a free hunt. There were many petrol tankers in these convoys. They were easy to set on fire, and just firing at them would do the job. Once you set them on fire, it would demoralize the entire column as everyone could see the smoke. We always wanted to hit DRA columns since they wouldn't fight, whereas Soviet columns would. Usually, when a column would come, the enemy would establish security forces at suspected ambush sites and occupy them until the column passed or until they were certain that nothing was going to happen. Many times, we wouldn't risk taking on the entire column. We would attack the tail, since the enemy would not turn back to help the petroleum tankers at the rear. The column would often reach Gardez, but they would have lost a piece of it along the way. Attacking the column from the rear was less risk to us, although sometimes there would be some APCs at the rear of the column. The enemy reaction when caught in the kill zone was usually ineffective. They normally stopped, dismounted, and took cover. They fought back only when assistance arrived. We learned to hit the column and leave. We did not want to fight reinforcements or helicopters because we did not have enough combat power, and it was very hard to move our wounded from the area under fire. Later in the morning, a Soviet security force of armored vehicles moved close to us and occupied a position. Then the column came from the north. The security force rejoined the column before the entire column passed. This left the fuel tankers in the rear of the column for us. We hit them by surprise, and it was effective. We damaged or destroyed 1 jeep and 9 tankers. Mohammed Hasham took out an armored security vehicle with his RPG. We later learned that 2 Russians fled from the southbound column when we ambushed it. They were captured by Mujahideen from HIH. As we were getting ready to leave the ambush site, a Soviet armored column came from the south. My southern security group had already pulled back, so we were caught totally by surprise. They began pouring fire into our ranks. 4 helicopters also flew over, firing at us. Mohammed Hashim hit 1 helicopter with his RPG, but the fight was unequal. All of my group, except for Asan and myself, were wounded. Most of them were wounded while we were withdrawing. Most were lightly wounded, but 2 of them are still paralyzed. What happened is that as we ambushed the tail of the southbound column, a northbound column was traveling up the same section of road. The heavily armored head of the northbound column arrived at the kill zone as we were withdrawing. Helicopters were flying air cover for the arriving column as well. Since my southern security group had withdrawn, we did not know of their arrival until they were firing on us. Commentary. The road runs through a deep gorge 3 kilometers south of Dihina. The Soviets probably had anticipated problems at this area and leapfrogged the security force there and put the helicopters overhead to deal with this probable ambush site. Security elements should be the last elements to pull out of an ambush, not the first. The southern security element should have been south on the high ground where it could see. Simple handheld walkie-talkie radios and a security element that performs its mission would have averted disaster for this Mujahideen commander. The RPG-7 could be an effective anti-helicopter weapon, particularly when several RPGs were fired simultaneously at a hovering helicopter or at a helicopter on the ground. Vignette 8. Ambush near Abdullah-i-Burj by Haji Abdul Qadar and Haji Kasab. In October 1980, a Soviet column left its base in Bagram to conduct a 4-day operation against the Mujahideen in the Nezra district of Kapisa province. To get there, they crossed the Abdullah-i-Burj bridge over the Panjshir River. The bridge is on the main highway connecting Bagram with the provincial capitals of Mahmud Iraqi and De Baba Ali, and other major towns including Golbahar in the north and Sarobi in the south. Since this is the only bridge over the Panjshir River in this region, Mujahideen felt that the Soviet force would return to their base by the same route. The Mujahideen, based around the Abdullah-i-Burj, decided to ambush the column on its return trip when the troops were tired and more vulnerable. They decided to hit the column while it was crossing over the bridge from Kapisa to Parwan province. The Soviets would be most vulnerable when half their column had crossed the river and their force was divided by the river. Map 9, Burj. Haji Abdul Qadir and Haji Kasab jointly planned and executed the ambush. They decided to let the Soviet force move unopposed until the head of the column reached Kali Na, about 3.5 kilometers southwest of the bridge. The Mujahideen had watched the column depart and knew how long the column was. They calculated that when the column reached Kali Na, half of the column would still be on the north of the river and the tail of the column just south of De Baba Ali. Haji Abdul Qadir's group, about 150 men, would set up their ambush south of the river along the Bagram-Kapisa road. They would set up in the orchards and hills between Kali Na and Abdullah-i Burj. Haji Kasab, reinforced with local mujahideen from Commander Shan's group, about 200 altogether, would ambush north of the river between Abdullah-i Burj and De Baba Ali. The two areas were part of the normal AOs of the two commanders. In both areas, the mujahideen positioned their RPG-7s close to the road and their heavy machine guns further back on dominant terrain. The mujahideen also supported the ambushes with a few recoilless rifles and 82mm mortars. On October 5th, the mujahideen secretly deployed into their designated positions and prepared covered positions for their anti-tank weapons. The Soviet column returned that afternoon. It moved unopposed across the bridge at Abdullah-i Burj, and the head of the column reached Kali Na around 1600 hours. Then, at Haji Abdul Qadir's signal, the ambushers opened fire on the tanks, APCs, and trucks along the entire length of the column. The Soviets were caught by surprise. South of the river, the Soviet forces drove off the road to try to escape to the open plain. However, many vehicles were hit and destroyed by RPG-7 fire. Vehicles were burning, and the Soviet infantry, which dismounted from the APCs, came under heavy machine gun fire. On the north side of the river, there is little room for vehicles to maneuver in the surrounding green zone of orchards and vineyards. Many soldiers abandoned their vehicles and rushed to try and ford the river. Some soldiers were washed away, while others made it to the other side and headed for Bagram across the open plain. Many Soviet soldiers were in a state of panic, and overall command and control had broken down. Some troops established perimeter defenses around their vehicles to hold up until help came. Others abandoned their vehicles and escaped toward Bagram. Some 20 to 30 vehicles were burning. Night fell. Soviet artillery pounded mujahideen positions around Kali Na, but it was not very effective. The mujahideen moved through the burning and abandoned vehicles, removing supplies and scores of weapons. In the morning, the Soviets sent a relief column from Bagram to relieve the trapped column. The mujahideen withdrew from the battlefield. At 0800 hours, the remnants of the Soviet column moved on to their Bagram base. Mujahideen losses were light. Haji Abdul Qadir's group had 2 KIA and 7 WIA. Total enemy casualties are unknown. Commentary. There were several factors contributing to the Mujahideen's success. First, proper selection of the ambush site was key. The Mujahideen caught the Soviet column straddling the river and forced it to fight 2 separate, unsupported battles. There was little room to maneuver except over the southern escape route. Second, the time of the ambush was optimum. The late afternoon arrival gave Mujahideen gunners enough time to inflict maximum damage, but not enough for Soviet air power to react. Soviet artillery could cover only a portion of the battlefield, and apparently no forward observers were forward to adjust artillery fire during the night. Third, the Mujahideen had surprise. The column had driven out on this road unmolested and expected to return unopposed. The soldiers were cold and tired, and their guard was down. The head of the column could see Bagram Air Base when they were hit. Fourth, the simultaneous attack along the entire length of the column stripped the convoy commander of any uncommitted force which he could use as an emergency reserve. The Mujahideen occupied very wide ambush frontages relative to their manpower, and this allowed them to attack the entire convoy simultaneously. In retrospective, there is little more that the Mujahideen could have done except employ mines and mortar fire on the southern escape route. The Soviet commander contributed to his own defeat. He had poor intelligence on the area that he was traveling through and did not use reconnaissance forces effectively. He did not use forward detachments to seize dominant terrain and obvious choke points, such as the Abdullah Burj Bridge, in advance of the column. He was highly predictable and used the same route to return that he had left on, yet failed to post security along the route to support his movement. He failed to leapfrog artillery groups along the column so that artillery fire support was immediately available. He apparently did not have helicopter gunships on standby to respond to ambush. He appears to have not trained his force in standard counter-ambush drills and procedures. He apparently lost control of the column within the first minutes of the ambush. The Soviet force in Bagram was reluctant to go to the aid of the beleaguered column at night. Apparently, they were afraid of also being ambushed. This reluctance to leave the relative safety of their base camp at night was to the Mujahideen advantage. Vignette 9. Dequaja Ambush by Commander Mullah Malang. In 1982, the Soviet 70th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, supported by DRA forces, launched a block and sweep operation against the Mujahideen forces in the center of Panjwai district. Panjwai district is located some 25 kilometers southwest of Kandahar city. Mujahideen sources estimate that hundreds of enemy tanks, APCs, BMPs, and other vehicles were involved in the 25-day operation. The Soviet purpose was to punish the Mujahideen groups who constantly harassed Soviet and DRA troop columns and supply convoys on the main Kandahar-Herat highway. The operation was also designed to destroy the resistance bases in the area and widen the security zone around the government-controlled district center. The Soviet operation in Panjwai required constant resupply from the main Soviet base located in the Kandahar air base. The supply columns had to travel along the main Chaman-Kandahar road to its junction with the Kabul-Herat highway and then proceed through Dequaja and Kandahar city to Sarpuza, where the Panjwai access road joins the main highway. Map 10A, Dequaja 1. The Mujahideen groups around Kandahar decided to launch a diversionary action against the enemy in order to relieve the pressure on the resistance in Panjwai. The Mujahideen realized that the Soviets were weakest and most vulnerable along their supply route and, therefore, decided to strike them there. Although the Mujahideen could conduct small-scale ambushes along the entire stretch of the road, there were only two places suitable for large-scale ambushes. One is a 2-kilometer length of road between Manzel Bagh Chak and Dequaja. The other is a 1.5-kilometer stretch between Shar-e-Na and Sarpuza. The local Mujahideen groups in the Malajat held a council of war and decided to block the road and conduct a large-scale ambush at each site. In addition to the ambush forces, the Mujahideen also designated support groups for both ambushes to protect the flanks and rear of the blocking ambush detachments. About 150 Mujahideen split up into small groups, moved from the Malajat area during the night, and took up positions in the orchards, buildings, and ditches along the main road between the Manzel Bagh Chak and Dequaja gas station. The backup group for the detachment deployed south of the city. Map 10B, Dequaja 2. A similar detachment blocked the road between Shar-e-Na and Sarpuza. Early in the morning, a convoy of trucks carrying ammunition, rockets, and gasoline moved from the Kandahar air base toward Panjwai. As the column reached the first roadblock, the Mujahideen opened fire simultaneously with RPG-7s, machine guns, rifles, and a recoilless rifle. Taken by surprise, the column stopped while the Soviet security vehicles returned fire. Their fire hit the Dequaja residential areas and caused much destruction. However, Mujahideen fire finally struck the ammunition trucks. They caught fire and hundreds of rockets and boxes of other ammunition began to explode. The explosions were so powerful that burning tires from APCs were thrown as far as Balakars, some 2 kilometers from the ambush site. The ambush destroyed about 30 enemy supply trucks and damaged many others. The rest of the Soviet convoy turned back. The Mujahideen roadblocked at Shar-e-Na and Sarpuza had no enemy to attack. This Mujahideen ambush had a decisive impact on the enemy operation in that it forced the Soviet forces to end their siege of Mujahideen forces in the Panjwai and return to Kandahar. However, in order to prevent future ambushes in the area, the Soviet forces bulldozed the Khwaja homes along the main road out to a distance of 300 meters from the highway. Commentary. Security of the lines of communication was a constant challenge facing the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. Security of the lines of communication determined the amount of forces which the Soviet could deploy in Afghanistan and also determined the scale and frequency of offensive combat directed against the Afghan resistance forces. In this example, the Soviets had to move supplies to a large group of forces about 50 kilometers away. The road, although an all-season major highway, was vulnerable to Mujahideen ambushes at almost every point. Further, the Soviets and Mujahideen fought for control of Kandahar for the entire war. The Soviets knew that the road was not secure, and yet the convoy commander did little to ensure the security of the movement along the supply route. A preliminary road-clearing patrol could have preempted the Mujahideen's successful ambush. Instead, their entire operation was disrupted due to their failure to move the supplies to Panjwai. Normally, the Soviets based APCs throughout the convoy as security vehicles. In case of ambush, the APCs would stop in the kill zone and return fire while the rest of the convoy, caught in the kill zone, would drive out of it. The portion of the convoy not under attack would stop and wait for the APCs to drive off the ambushers. Then, when the ambushers had been driven off, the convoy would reform and continue. This is why the Mujahideen established 2 ambush zones. They did not think that they would stop the convoy at the first ambush, and so the second ambush was ready to hit the Soviet convoy again. On the other hand, it took the Mujahideen about 3 weeks to decide to help the resistance forces in Panjwai by hitting the Soviets elsewhere. Had they launched their attack earlier, it could have forced their enemy to terminate his operation against Mujahideen groups in Panjwai earlier.